permission to proceed, sir. Good evening to one and all. I welcome you to the first Monsoon Musing of this year. My name is Danar D'Souza and I shall be the anchor for today. Vice Admiral Sanjay Bhalla, NM, Chief of Staff. Rear Admiral Vineet McCarthy, Flag Officer Commanding Western Fleet. Rear Admiral A.N. Pramod, Flag Officer Maharashtra Naval Area. Rear Admiral Kunal Singh Rajkumar, Chief Staff Officer Operations. Rear Admiral R. Vinod Kumar, Flag Officer Doctrine and Concept. Veterans, serving officers, naval personnel, members of MHS, media personnel, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. May I once again request you to recheck that your mobile phones and devices are switched off or on silent mode. May I now call upon Commodore Ashish Khanna, Director, Maritime History Society, to deliver the introductory address.
Vice Admiral Sanjay Bhalla, Chief of Staff and Chairman, Maritime History Society. Admiral B.S. Shekhawat, former Chief of Naval Staff. Vice Admiral I.C. Rao, former Chief of Material. Rear Admiral Vineet McCarthy, the Flag Officer Commanding Western Fleet. Rear Admiral A.N. Pramod, Flag Officer Maharashtra Area and Vice Chairman, Maritime History Society. Rear Admiral K.S. Rajkumar, Chief Staff Officer Operations. Rear Admiral R. Vinod Kumar, Flag Officer Doctrine and Concepts. Commanding Officers, Directors, Officers, Media Personnel, members and friends of MHS, ladies and gentlemen. It is my proud privilege to extend a warm welcome to the first Monsoon Musings lecture series for the year 2023. A brainchild of late Vice Admiral M.P. Avati, Maritime History Society was established on 12th May 1978. It is a premier research organization where all enthusiasts in maritime history can learn about the richness and diversity of Indian maritime heritage. It was the vision of a patron emeritus who curated the Monsoon series lecture for personnel of the Indian Navy so as to nurture scholar warriors for the future. The first lecture of the Monsoon Music series is the Admiral J.G. Nadkarni Memorial Lecture. Admiral J.G. Nadkarni was the 12th Chief of the Naval Staff, founder, trustee and former patron of MHS. An avid navigator, Admiral Nadkarni promoted the cause of spreading maritime consciousness amongst a wider audience, shedding the dormancy of our maritime vision. Coming to today's event, the broad theme of the lecture is maritime law. India's geography, with its vast coastline and extensive island territories, bequeaths it with an enviable maritime milieu. Maritime laws are of significant importance to India as they ensure security, prosperity, and sustainable development of its maritime sector while safeguarding the maritime environment and promoting international cooperation. Legal framework plays a crucial role in regulating activities and resolving disputes in the maritime domain. There are a gamut of maritime and admiralty laws that govern India's maritime domain, including the Indian Ports Act, the Merchant Shipping Act, the Major Ports Trust Act, the Territorial Waters Continental Shelf Exclusive Economic Zone and other Maritime Zones of India Act, the Maritime Zones of India Act 1981, the Inland Waterways Authority of India Act, the Maritime Pollution Act and Admiralty Act of 2017. These acts provide a framework for the autonomy, governance, functioning and efficient management of resources, promoting competitiveness and attracting investments in the maritime sector. Additionally, they regulate matters related to Indian flag vessels, seafarers, shipping registration, safety and pollution prevention. All these national acts function in conjunction with the United Nations Convention on the Laws of Sea or UNCLOS, which was adopted in 1982 and is a comprehensive international legal framework governing all aspects of world's ocean. UNCLOS provides the blueprint for the rights and responsibility of coastal states, including India, and sets out legal regime for the seas and their resources. It serves as a vital framework of India's maritime policies, ensuring the protection of marine resources, resolving maritime disputes, and upholding freedom of navigation. By adhering to UNCLOS principles, India aims to promote sustainable development, maritime security, and cooperation in an ever-evolving maritime domain. Today, our guest speaker, Dr. Pooja Bhatt, will highlight the historical settings of UNCLOS and the importance of this legal convention and its ramification in safeguarding India's maritime interests. I will now hand over the proceeding to our MC to formally introduce the speaker and carry forward the proceedings. Jai Hind. Over to you.
Thank you, sir. With this, we come to today's Admiral J.G. Nadkarni Memorial Lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, we gather here today to honor the memory and legacy of Admiral Jayant Ganpat Nadkarni, a remarkable leader and an esteemed figure in the history of Indian Navy. Admiral Nadkarni was born on December 5, 1931 at Pune, Maharashtra. After completion of his training at the T.S. Dufferin, he joined the Royal Indian Navy in March 1949. He subsequently underwent training at the Royal College Dartmouth, after which he was drafted for training at the HNS Devonshire and other Royal Navy establishments. In his long career, Admiral Nadkarni served as Flag Officer, Western Fleet, the 12th Chief of Naval Staff. As we reflect on his distinguished career and profound contributions, we pay tribute to a man whose indomitable spirit and unwavering commitment to his nation left an indelible mark on the maritime landscape. Our guest speaker for today's lecture is Dr. Pooja Bhatt, and she shall share her thoughts on India and UNCLOS, historical background, engagement with international maritime laws, and its interaction with domestic laws. Dr. Pooja Bhatt is a consultant at the Policy Planning and Research Division, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India. She is the author of 9-Line, Deciphering the South China Sea Conundrum. Besides working extensively on maritime issues, particularly Indo-Pacific and South China Sea, Dr. Pooja writes on issues related to defense and Asian security architecture. Dr. Pooja was a part of the prestigious Indian Navy history book, A Decade of Transformation, signaling power and partnerships unveiled by the Honorable President of India on Navy Day 2022. Previously, she taught as assistant professor in the School of Defense and Strategic Studies at Rashtriya Raksha University, Gandhinagar. Prior to that, she worked at the Center for Air Power Studies, New Delhi, and the Indian Council of World Affairs, a research institute under the Ministry of External Affairs, India. She has published extensively on several leading platforms in India and abroad, as well as been a speaker on maritime issues at various reputed international seminars, which include US Indo-PACOM Conference, CSIS Washington, DC, Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam, Hanoi, East-West Center, Hawaii, amongst others. She has been invited by US Naval War College to present her paper on maritime security and governance that was published in the prestigious International Law Quarterly in 2020. Dr. Pooja Bhatt received her doctoral degree from the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University in 2021. She holds a postgraduate degree in International Relations and MPhil in Diplomacy and Disarmament from JNU. She also holds a diploma in the United Nations Conventions on the Law of the Seas, UNCLOS, from Yesu Academy, Korea Maritime Institute, on which she shall speak today. Dr. Pooja shall speak on the Indian perspective of the UNCLOS and how India is leading the cause of the Global South in shaping the contours of UNCLOS 3. She shall look back on historical developments in India's maritime laws and the lack of awareness thereof. I request Dr. Pooja Bhatt to grace the stage.
Chief of Staff, Vice Admiral Sanjay Bhalla, Admiral V.S. Shekhawat, former CNS, Admiral I.C. Rao, Flag Officers, Director of Maritime History Society, officers and men in Indian Navy, and my fellow maritime scholars. Good evening. I am quite honored and humbled to be here speaking to you on UNCLOS. It's like preaching the choir. However, I am going to take next half an hour to 40 minutes of your time to tell Indian perspective, or my own perspective on UNCLOS and how it deals with India's own domestic laws on maritime issues. But before I start, I have to mention that I am humbled more so because the location, INS Ashwini, is something also dear to me. because I myself is a daughter of nursing officer, and I think my mother would be very proud today to see her daughter speaking in a the military hospital auditorium and on the issue of military and defense. So before I start, I would want to give some disclaimers. There would be 3 of them. First of all, I am not a maritime lawyer. I am a maritime scholar. I study defense and strategic studies with quite interest, and it has been a long time interaction within defense issues. So whatever I'm going to speak today is my appreciation of the fact that anything that we do in maritime domain in terms of our defense policies cannot be read without maritime laws. And with that idea and view, I started studying international maritime laws and domestic maritime laws. And I see that people here are already engaging in UNCLOS and various aspects of it. And if we have any hydrographers, or if you have anyone from JAG branch, and anyone who has interacted on the UNCLOS, it would be a great honor to interact with those people after this session is over. And I would love to know your views about this presentation. Second disclaimer is, this presentation is a part of my larger book project that I am looking for in the future about India and UNCLOS. So there are certain part of the project's slides that you might find not complete, and the interaction here would help us complete those entire picture. And last my disclaimer would be that while by speaking throughout the slides, I'll leave out certain strands here and there, in a hope that towards the end of it, I will bring them all together to make the larger picture of India and UNCLOS. So bear with me for next half an hour to 40 minutes, please. So the purpose of this talk is to familiarize us as a maritime community about the importance and relevance, and these 2 are separate words, importance and relevance of international maritime laws, and also highlight that not only India was engaged in shaping the UNCLOS 1982 over the decades, but also its own domestic laws were shaped by it. Maritime domain is governed by certain laws, and seafarers and maritime community, as seafarers and maritime community, it is our responsibility to educate ourselves and familiarize ourselves on the various issues and provisions covered by this law. So my structure of the talk looks like this. First, I'll be covering the origin of UNCLOS 1, 2, 3, because UNCLOS 1982 is the 3rd part of it, as most of you would know. Then second part, we'll be talking about India's own contribution in the making of the convention. Then how India's own domestic laws were framed by it and shaped by it. Coming to sharing 2 more incidents which were quite recent, but it also goes to highlight that why international maritime laws and Indian own maritime laws should be read more carefully by everyone who is within the seafaring community and anyone who's understanding maritime issues. Lastly, there are some issues between UNCLOS and MZI Act of India, and I would like to highlight them here because I believe that more people will think on these issues, more solutions we might arrive at, and these remain still unresolved. And I will end with final thoughts. So what was the heart of the UNCLOS negotiations? Why did this start? Fisheries. So prior to around 1940s, 50s, a lot of countries were fighting among themselves to gain more and more claim on the maritime domain, because beyond the 3-mile zone within the water domain, maritime domain, the rest of the waters were governed by the freedom of the seas. So anyone with the right wherewithal, distant fleets could encroach the waters in the high seas. And there were a lot of cases going on during 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Few of them I've mentioned here: Anglo-Norwegian fisheries case, 1935, which actually led to a lot of international laws later. Another case is North Sea Continental Shelf case, which actually it brought out another aspect of maritime domain, which was the underwater resources that were available, and how countries in the future were going to fight for it. And that started somewhere in 1960s itself between Germany and Norway, when they started fighting that who will have the continental shelf. So it was basically a run for fisheries and run for resources, which led to these negotiations, because the rich countries of the world, the developed countries of the world, had the wherewithal. The losers were the developing and the underdeveloped countries. With that kind of understanding, the countries of the world came together to bring about a convention where not only the developed world is considered, but the voices of the developing and underdeveloped world is also considered. Meanwhile, the world was fighting on the fisheries and resources. Here in India, we had our own fights going on. So before we got independence under the British India, we had several fisheries acts and laws going on between kingdoms, because the initial 1897 Act, and I have to mention about Arthashastra also, because it's very important to understand that Chanakya mentions that the coastal state would have certain limit of maritime domain under its jurisdiction, and I'm paraphrasing the entire thing, to say that the coastal state can have some fishing rights over it. The Arthashastra never mentioned the limit of that delimitation, but it does mention the rights of coastal states in the maritime domain. Coming forward to British India, 1897 was the first time when British India understood that we need to bring the fisheries factor within the jurisdiction, and then the Indian Fisheries Act came up in 1897. The same act was carried forward in 1935 when the Government of India Act came, and it was decided that the 3-mile rule, which was followed all over the world, based on the cannon shot rule, and we all know here that the cannon shot had a limit of maximum 3 miles, and that was the reason why coastal countries had the jurisdiction over the waters up to 3 miles. So that was kept as a 3-mile limit under the Government of India 1935 Act. So the entire game was that time going behind fisheries and the resources in the maritime domain, and this led to adoption of Article 297 by Indian Constitution, which was an amendment in 1945, where it said all lands, minerals, and other things of value underlying the ocean within the territorial waters of India shall vest in the Union and be held purposes for the Union. Let me remind you that during that time, the limit was only 3 nautical miles. It was around 1960s, the limits were revised up to 6 nautical miles in the maritime domain. Coming to UNCLOS 1958, so the rich and the poor countries of the world came together, and finally they agreed on 4 conventions, and these are important conventions. That's why I want to spell it out each for you. First is Convention on the Territorial Sea and Contiguous Zone, that came into force, and still the territorial limits were not decided. Contiguous Zone was mentioned, but there was nothing much said about it. Second convention that came into picture was the Convention of Continental Shelf. It was led by the developing countries because they wanted to explore and exploit the resources of a continental shelf, and it was totally a developing world idea. Third convention that came into picture was Convention on the High Seas, where they said that waters beyond the territorial waters would be considered high seas, and it would be free for all to use. Free for all to use was the idea why high seas was contemplated. Last was again fishing and conservation of living resources in the high seas were another reason why the fourth convention came into picture. So the idea of saying all this is, you can make it out that it was completely a first world idea of seeing how waters should be governed and how it should benefit them. Understandably, India did not become party to any of the conventions in 1958. Second time, in 1960, the negotiations started again, and it was basically turned unsuccessful because none of the conditions were fulfilled. Countries wanted the limitations of territorial waters to be fixed, high seas to be clarified more better, but none of them were achieved, and the second convention was basically a dud. The negotiation for UNCLOS 3 started somewhere in 1970s, and this was the first time when India and the developing world came on board to decide on the rulings of how the negotiations will be done. And this, as an Indian, I would be proud to say that UNCLOS 3, India was a sole running voice for the global south since then. Most of the conventions that UNCLOS 3 adopted in and I'll be talking more about it, the conventions adopted in 1982 were voiced very strongly by Indian representatives at the UNCLOS. So it's a very proud moment to say that India was a very solid member for UNCLOS 3. Finally, after 11 sessions between 1973 to 1982 and several absentations and everything, the UNCLOS 3 was adopted in 1982. However, still developed countries like US, UK, Germany, and some other countries like Turkey, Venezuela, that had some maritime claims and rights during that time, did not sign the convention. However, it was very well received by the developing and the underdeveloped countries of the world, and most of them became party to it. UNCLOS, as you know, it's a constitution of the seas. It is a massive document. It's very well written. It is, I'll be talking about more, and it has 320 articles covering a whole range of maritime issues that we see everyday basis during our interaction in the maritime domain. And it was during UNCLOS 3 that the 200 nautical mile zone EEZ concept came for the first time. Before I move forward, I have to talk about India's own contribution to negotiation as Indian Navy's contribution. Apart from the big member team that was present every year for the negotiations during the next 11 sessions in the UNCLOS 3, two names that I could right now find out was Rear Admiral Francis Fraser, who was chief hydrographer. He started when he was a Commodore. By the time he retired, he was a Rear Admiral. And similarly, Commodore O.P. Sharma, who was a JAG in the Indian Navy. And they were two of the most important voices when it came to voicing India's requirements. So before I move forward, I thought it would be only wise to talk a little bit more about both of these personalities, because I understand that the senior members of the Indian Navy are still aware of these names and their involvement in the UNCLOS. It is for the benefit of the newer generation and the younger public that I would want to talk a little bit more about Rear Admiral Fraser and Commodore O.P. Sharma. So Rear Admiral Frank Fraser had a considerable experience in Indian Navy before he became a hydrographic surveyor in 1949. As lieutenant, he was appointed in Iron Surveying Ship Investigator in 1950. Then later on, he also was attached with Royal Navy Surveying Ship Franklin. He went on to become Hydrographic Surveying Officer in Indian Navy Surveying Ship Sutlej, Investigator again. And finally, he became Executive Officer in INS Ranjit, where he was also heading the surveying missions. He is a highly meritorious. He had a meritorious service, and he was highly awarded. He was awarded AVSM in 1972. He also was given Padma Shri in 1982 for his prestigious services to the nation. But the most important thing is he was elected as the president of directing committee in the International Hydrographic Bureau in Monte Carlo in 1982, where he was heading the directing committee for the next 5 years. This is the obituary that I found, sadly, from International Hydrographic Review, Monaco, and I did not find his mention, at least open sources in India. So I thought it is worthwhile bringing his name and his contribution to this talk and project. The Rear Admiral Francis Leslie Fraser died of cardiac arrest in Delhi on April 1st, 1990, after a brief illness. Now, O.P. Sharma, Admiral O.P. Sharma, he was the first Judge Advocate General in the Indian Navy and deputed by the Government of India as the member of Indian delegation to the third UN Conference on the Law of the Sea. He attended all the sessions between 1975 and 1982. And when the UN Convention was formally adopted, he retired as Rear Admiral and was decorated by the President of India with awards such as AVSM and VSM. One of the most important contributions is he fought for India's maximum interest. He regularly in his talks and speeches in those sessions at UNCLOS, he used to talk about why and how government of India had the rights to restrict what we call freedom of navigation in exclusive economic zone to ensure peace and security of the country, given the geopolitical atmosphere of the time. But all these provisions were rejected during the negotiation of the final draft of UNCLOS because US and certain other countries did not like it. And that is when Admiral O.P. Sharma argued, and it was famously said, he said, India had an obligation to modify its relevant domestic legislation after India formally ratified the treaty. I think that gave a thought of, ratifying domestic laws to suit our India's own interests. So finally, when 1982, UNCLOS was adopted, and what it did was, what the free seas were beyond the territorial waters, it divided the entire maritime domain into 9 big zones. We have internal waters, territorial waters, EEZ. So this map should be helpful. I'm not very sure of how clear it is. But then beyond the territorial waters, we have exclusive economic contiguous zone for 12 nautical mile, exclusive economic zone for 200 nautical mile. Beyond that, we have high seas. And also the undersea domain was demarcated by the UNCLOS. From territorial waters onward, we have continental shelf up to 200 nautical mile and give and take till 350 nautical mile on certain technical reasons. Beyond that, the water beneath high seas is called the area. Why I'm mentioning all of these names is because all of these zones are now governed by different laws. So the area is governed by the International Seabed Authority. We have all heard about it. The continental shelf is governed by convention on CLCS, on the legality of continental shelf. So these are, all domains are now governed. The maritime domain in terms is no more ungovernable. All these zones have their own legislations, which we all as maritime scholars and seafarers should be aware of. It also provided for archipelagic waters, sea lanes, and straits for international navigation. So these were 9 zones that is now mentioned in UNCLOS, and any issue pertaining to these 9 zones, we can pick up our UNCLOS or open our laptops, download UNCLOS manual, and we can see that each of these issues can be addressed using UNCLOS convention. Apart from that, what UNCLOS does, as Director MHS also rightly mentioned, it does 2 things. It establishes the legal status of the maritime domain and this zone, and also gives the coastal state some rights over certain domains. Such as the territorial waters is as good as India's own jurisdiction because we have our sovereignty over it. However, when we move towards contiguous zone and beyond, India has sovereign rights. So there is a difference between sovereignty and sovereign rights, and it is very important that we are aware of it. When it comes to contiguous zone, one of the important things that has to be considered that India has complete jurisdiction only on 4 issues: custom, fiscal, immigration, and sanitary. Apart from that, all issues of contiguous zone they are treated as good as the high seas, and it is on the jurisdiction of the coastal state on how they want to govern it. This point is important because again, this is a strand that I'll pull in later on to discuss how India can use this clause in its own favor. Then we are talking about these laws are being applicable not just on commercial vessels but also in warships in certain conditions. Also, the definition of warship is given in UNCLOS. So any vessel cannot be termed as warship. There has to be certain condition that a ship has to fulfill to be called warship. Why this is important? Because again, when I bring up this case study, that becomes very relevant. It also provides privileges and immunities to coastal states and its seafarers in terms of when it comes to settlement of disputes. What are more important I want to highlight here is two issues about the new and emerging issues in the maritime domain. Now we are talking a lot about submarine cables, the protection of submarine pipelines, maritime scientific research, piracy, protection of maritime environment, development of artificial islands. These are the issues we are seeing right now. And these are the issues already addressed in 1982 UNCLOS. So when if we find any legalities on these issues right now, we can very well go back and refer to UNCLOS 1982, and we might find most of the solutions within it. Another important thing that UNCLOS also brought through was how these resources like fisheries and minerals will be governed. There is a special section now within UNCLOS which demarcates the coastal states, the landlocked states, the developing countries, in how they want to govern, how they should govern the maritime resources, how much they can keep, how much they can, they have to donate it back for the larger good of the world. So that kind of equitable justification was done under UNCLOS. And it is very important because most of the developing countries such as Germany and others which hold most of the patents when it comes to undersea technologies and undersea wherewithals that they have, and developing countries end up generally getting nothing. So it is very important that UNCLOS also envisioned that time that how these underdeveloped countries and developing countries would be getting the part of undersea resources and fisheries to their favor in the coming years. I also briefly mentioned about archipelagic state. It was a revolutionary concept which was pushed by Indonesia, that you all would know, during that time, because it did not see itself, Indonesia did not see itself as having a clear baseline. So they just wanted, to gain more and more waters under this jurisdiction, basically, so that they can cover as much as water they can because of the spread of Indonesia as an island. So archipelagic basically started as a concept for Indonesia, and there are other countries which are following it. But before becoming an archipelagic, there is a technical justification that UNCLOS also says that a country has to provide before it can start even claiming itself as archipelagic, because there has to be a ratio of 9:1 of water as to land ratio. If a country fulfills that kind of ratio in its territorial zone, it can claim as itself as an archipelagic state. So this concept is now used by a lot of other countries to justify their own baselines. In this regard, contribution of great K.M. Panikkar also has to be mentioned here, that it was very foreseeing of him in 1950s and 60s when he said that the distinct water fishing fleets had no rights to take the resources of developing coastal states to augment the calorie and protein intakes of their already well-fed population. This shows two things. Not only he considered that the developed countries are eating away the protein and resources of the developing countries by overfishing, he also made it a point that distinct fishing fleets were a thing that time, and it's only going to get worse, and we are seeing it right now. What was India's own contribution again to the UNCLOS? So beyond establishing EEZ, and establishment of EEZ is a sui generis case. EEZ is neither territorial, water is not high seas. It does not fall in any of the categories. Coastal states have 200 nautical miles for certain resource exploration for themselves, but rest of the portion has to be given treated as high seas, so countries cannot control it all. And it was purely done from the protection point of view of the countries, from the fisheries and exploration point of view. So economic and security were two of the driving factors why the concept came into consideration. And it was Kenya out of all the countries in the world that suggested that we should have waters beyond territorial zone to to fulfill our fisheries resources needs, because it is those waters, the exclusive economic zone waters, where the distant fishing fleets are coming and taking away our resources. And India, for one, was the loudest voice in the room to support Kenya that EEZ should come into existence. And India, in its subsequent sessions, kept fighting for that cause. It also led to formation of the Continental Shelf Convention and ISA Convention. India said, look, if the high seas are there, it's good, but we need a body to govern these areas. We cannot treat them just like high seas so that developed countries can take it away. So with that idea, there are bodies that cover both the continental shelf, and the International Seabed Authority do cover the seabed area, and India was the country that actually pushed for that idea. Apart from that, not only the global south was represented by India, India also represented the landlocked states. India realized that in South Asia, we have at least Asia, we have as many as landlocked countries, as many as coastal, and we have neighbors which have their needs towards the coastal side. So it's only fair to give them some kind of access and some kind of rights to something that is said to be as global commons. So if it's global commons, the coastal states should also have rights. So with that kind of idea, India also introduced the rights of coastal states and landlocked states. Lastly, India also literally fought tooth and nail to get state control over over 2-3 issues. One was pollution, because it realized that rich countries, ships and fleets would come and pollute the waters in the poor countries, coastal states. Second issue that it fought for was India's the coastal states' right over the maritime scientific research in the coastal area, because that time we did not have the wherewithal, and some of the members in the Indian delegation, including Mr. Vanikar, they realized that future is something India is looking at, and in the future we might have the wherewithal to extract resources in our own coastal areas, and that's why we should have marine scientific research reserved for the coastal states. And third was having artificial islands in the EEZ. These were 2-3 main issues that India fought tooth and nail. However, I have to also mention that the 200 nautical mile zone is arbitrary. There is no legal, technical justification why we have 200 nautical miles. Developing countries were very happy having only 100 nautical mile zone. For some reason, I think it was, nobody knows what happened behind the doors, but the discussions that we read on archives and papers, it says it was the developing countries which wanted 200 nautical miles as a developed countries, I mean, as a EEZ. So nobody knows why we have a 200 nautical mile EEZ, but we have it now. Next, I want to talk about how India's own domestic laws were shaped. So while India was engaged in the negotiation, UNCLOS negotiations from early 1950s and 60s, it felt during the negotiation that we ourselves lack certain domestic laws. We do not have domestic maritime laws, and when UNCLOS would come into picture, we might lose a lot. I think that was the idea, seeing the negotiation globally, that Indian delegation thought it would be a worthwhile thing to revise our domestic laws. We were still being governed by the Government of India Act 1935 with 3 and then 6 nautical mile territorial water zone. So first thing that was done in 1972 is to bring about the Territorial Sea, Continental Shelf, Economic Zone and other Maritime Zones Act, which is also famously known as Maritime Zones of India Act 1972, and it was later revised in 1981 to bring in the fisheries clause again, so to bring in the causes of the fishermen community and their rights over the waters. So it was the first act that India produced. What is important about this MZI Act is there are certain clauses which were, though it was adopted in 1972, and 10 years later the UNCLOS came into picture. India did mirror most of those clauses. So we have territorial waters, 12 nautical miles, then we have a contiguous zone for another 12 nautical miles, we have EEZ 200 nautical mile and high seas beyond it. So all those things were mirrored within MZI Act. Second thing is, we realized that we did not have enough, we have not done enough for the EEZ basically. So in 1977, we brought out the Economic Zone Act, where we defined what economic zone, India's economic zone, exclusive economic zone would look like, and there were certain provisions provided in that. I've already spoken about the Fisheries Act 1981, that was amendment to 1972 MZI Act. Then, fast forward to 3 decades, 4 decades, we did not have any maritime related legislations coming up, and we understand that there was less of maritime consciousness, and we were more bothered about the territorial adversities that we had. However, during that time, we started facing a lot of issues in terms of piracy, in terms of smuggling. So it was at high time that we had certain domestic laws, that address that. So while Coast Guard Act was there since 1978, and its duty was to ensure and enforce this MZI Act in the maritime zones of India, another revision was brought in 2019, and I'll be talking about it next slide. And this empowered Coast Guard with more powers on certain issues in the maritime domain. Next act which came into the picture, which was quite recent, was Anti-Maritime Piracy Act, and I'll also talk about it a bit more. So this is the Gazette 2019 of Coast Guard Act, where before this, Coast Guard did not have rights to apprehend the pirates and other illegal activities on the sea, because they had limited powers and they had to go through certain other Indian Act, Arms Act, Passport Act, and something else. So they did not per se had some kind of powers to go aboard and do the searching. It was in 2019 Act that this VBSS, that we all know, that Visit, Board, Search and Seize powers were given exclusively to Coast Guard within the Indian EEZ to catch hold of any pirates and just do the apprehend them and bring them to the court of law. So this power was given to Coast Guard. Now this act is very important to say because there is a very, maybe some of us are aware, but mostly armed robbery and piracy is taken as one thing. But technically, UNCLOS says these are two different things. Armed robbery are the activities of theft and loss of property and life and everything happening within the territorial waters of the country of coastal state. So it is a limitation. However, piracy happens in high seas. So piracy is the act in high seas. Armed robbery is an act in territorial waters. What was happening was India was facing a lot of issues because of that, because then what happens to EEZ? What happens to security of EEZ? Then who is empowered to secure that? With that kind of idea, the Anti-Maritime Piracy Bill ensured that the law enforcement agencies, Indian Navy, Coast Guard, Marine Police, get certain kind of rights to apprehend the pirates and other illegal activities within the EEZ of India. This is even more important because it is the first time it also added the clause that the state can imprison those pirates or people for life, give them death sentence also, and if any kind of aiding is also fine, the 14th year of rigorous imprisonment there. This kind of provision is very, for the first time given in the Anti-Maritime Piracy Bill. And these laws are applicable for INCG to any kind of pirates of any nationality. So the nationality clause, which is generally used by the international community, that the person is of our nationality and he's in high seas, you cannot apprehend them, that no longer exists, because then as India we can say that our laws say that Indian Navy or Coast Guard and Marine Police can apprehend a person of any nationality in the EEZ found doing any kind of illegal activities. Now these are two cases I wanted to bring. First is Enrica Lexi case that we all are aware, which happened in 2012. So for the background, again I'll just run through. So merchant vessel Enrica Lexi opened unprovoked firing at St. Anthony, which was a small fishing boat, at 20.5 nautical mile in the Indian coast, which is the contiguous zone of India. So the Indian Coast Guard actually compelled the Enrica Lexi to come to Indian coast, and then Italian Marines, there were 2 Marines who opened the fire. They were reprimanded for homicide. Now what happened? The game starts here. It was not Indian waters. It was not easy. It was contiguous zone. Problem is, UNCLOS says very bare minimum. It's only small article about contiguous zone, that it lies from coastal coast to 24 nautical miles. That's it. Does not say anything more. However, MZI Act mentions that the central government can make certain kind of laws when it comes to the CFIS 4 condition I told, the custom, fiscal, sanitary and immigration. Apart from that, one more clause which was there was security of India. So taking that clause, Indian government could have acted basically to apprehend those 2 Marines and brought to Indian Court of Justice. However, Italian court basically said India has no jurisdiction because beyond territorial waters, it's high seas, and therefore India cannot try those Italian Marines in India. In this regard, I would also want to highlight one very important thing, and I think everyone should take it back with them when they go back and think about it, that when it comes to an issue where one and more states have the jurisdiction, such as contiguous zone and beyond, prescriptive jurisdiction can take place. It is a jurisdiction of state. Taking prescriptive jurisdiction, there are 5 principles basically, that if there is the territory of the coastal state, or nationality of the coastal state, or there is a national interest of the coastal state, or there is a physical custody of the offender, or passive personality of the nationality of the offender. So there are 4-5 issues that the jurisdiction gives us to empower the coastal state to apply these kind of law. So therefore, when Italian Marines were sent back, Supreme Court made a very interesting statement and said Kerala state cannot apprehend these and try these Italian Marines because they are it's Indian waters and not Kerala waters, but it is the jurisdiction of states that which leads to the legislative, judicial and administrative competence of the state and corresponding to their authority to prescribe, adjudicate and enforce. In other words, it's just jurisdiction does not only mean that you have the legislative rights and administrative rights. So India has those rights over coastal states, but it is the authority to prescribe and adjudicate and enforce those rights that makes you have the jurisdiction of the court. So in other words, it was a slap on the government's face that we had the authority, we had the laws, we just could not enforce our laws. And this is something I think everyone of us should go back and reflect on it, that how we have cases within our jurisdiction, we have laws available, it's just the disconnect between the two that we are not acting upon it or enforcing our own jurisdiction. Second case in this regard, I would talk about the Seaman Guard Ohio Arms Transfer case 2013. It was a case of floating armory. So I'm sure most of you are aware, I would be, for the benefit of others, I'll just be speaking about. Floating armory refers to a vessel that has the facility to store small wars, ammunition, equipments, etc. And usually it is operated beyond the territorial waters of the coastal state. It can be owned by a private company, it can be owned by a private contractor, anything. And also, very few laws are there that govern these floating armories. But UNCLOS has provided some provision. With that background, I'm going to talk about this. So, in 2013, we had this Seaman Guard Ohio ship in the Indian waters. They were in the pretext of carrying, weapons for anti-piracy. There were multinational crew members, 6 British former soldiers, 14 Estonians, 3 Ukrainians, 12 Indians, different nationalities. So Tamil Nadu police actually booked them put them under various acts, Arms Act, Passport Act. It still did not use the MZI Act. It did not use any other Indian Act. And then the case was too weak to be carried forward, and they were these, the entire crew members were acquitted in 2017. And even the basic 3,000 rupees fine that they were supposed to pay, that was also acquitted. So they were left. Whereas, I'm again mentioning, MZI Act says that if an act is happening within your contiguous zone and within your own waters, you can make security laws, you can enforce those security laws. So we lagged it again there. And again, we could have used UNCLOS also to our favor. So it was just the lack of knowledge, maybe lack of passion towards the case that we lost it. This will be my second last slide and I'll be done with it. There are certain unresolved issues between UNCLOS and MZI Act. I would like to talk about that also. The first is the issue of state baseline. This is something looked at with very hooded vision, because state baseline has been controversial as ever. We all know that baselines are basically calculated from the low watermark area from the coast onwards. But we all know land borders are different from maritime borders. We cannot calculate maritime borders as we try and calculate maritime land borders. So most of the coastal states have their boundaries which are jagged, which have fringes on the fringing islands or small landforms throughout their coastline. So it's not very easy to draw a coastline. So a lot of countries where they find their coastline to be bulging or fringing, they draw state coastlines, and they calculate their territorial waters, their contiguous zone easy accordingly. Why this is important? The moment you shift the baseline, you will lose millions and millions of nautical miles of your EEZ and your territorial waters. So that remains a very touchy issue for countries, even for India. UNCLOS provides certain clear, demarcation, technical reasons that how these baselines have to be given. India has not considered, though we have submitted our state baseline in 2009, and a lot of countries are not happy with it, and maybe India is looking into it. That is something for another day. But state baseline definitely remains an issue of contention between the developing countries and India, and as to how we are calculating our baselines and our EEZ. Second issue is of internal waters. This is again important because MZI Act does not cater for internal waters. It is only UNCLOS that provides that what the internal water should be, how it should be legislated, who should have the authority, of course the coastal state. But India, for some reason, while making MZI Act, did not ever considered internal waters, and out of which we had a lot of internal water issues when we made our coastlines, and we have bays on both east and west coast of ours. So that also became a very contentious issue within India also, that who will govern the internal water? Is it the Marine Police? Is it the Coast Guard? Navy cannot do it. So if a crime happens, and crimes like petty crimes like trafficking, terrorism, who is going to cover all that? So that remains an issue between within India and between also UNCLOS and India, developing country and India. Third issue I'll be talking about that I've already spoken about is armed robbery and piracy. That how these are two different technical terms we generally conflate, but it should be seen with very much caution, at least by people in the maritime domain, that armed robbery is not piracy, and India has laws for both piracy and armed robbery separately. Fourth is the issue of high seas, that how MZI Act does not still cater for high seas. It was made in 1972, again, but the MZI Act does not talk about any Indian right over EEZ. That time we maybe never thought that high seas would be something India would be interested, but I think it's high about time that we start also thinking that if something happens in the high seas, how a coastal state like India should act on its high seas. That is another unresolved issue that we need to think and ponder more upon. So these are my final thoughts, that India has had a great role in shaping UNCLOS, and not only India represented its own voice very well, it also represented the global south and other underdeveloped and developing countries. So I think that has been India's biggest contribution to UNCLOS. Second is, as we have now discussed, maritime domain is no longer governed. Every now and then we see new cases coming up. South China Sea and East China Sea are a few of them. There are a lot more cases all over the world where countries are fighting for resources, for maritime domain delimitation and other issues. So it's high time that countries should start looking at their maritime international laws as well as domestic laws. Third, should domestic laws be seen in conflict with international laws? Because international law, according to international law, when it comes to conflation between two, it is the international law that will prevail. So if there is an issue in which international law is also there and domestic law is also there, it would be only the international law that would be given preference. So in that regard, how is India supposed to act? Should we act in conflict with international law? Should we co-opt? Should we cooperate? There are a whole domain of issues and a whole lot of thinking that has to go behind those issues. And issues, we can talk about piracy, we can talk about emerging issues. We talk about it, and every issue we can talk about how international laws see them, how domestic laws see them, and how we should, bring a common line between these two. Another thought is, how are India's own maritime law enforcement agencies seeing UNCLOS? Is it only for Indian Navy to see UNCLOS as its important tool because Indian Navy goes to high seas? Is it not Coast Guard? Is it not Marine Police? So who are the relevant law enforcement agencies? How they should see these laws is another point that needs to be thought more often in these conferences and talks. Next issue is about the current and emerging issues. As we talk, every day you pick up a newspaper or a new maritime domain issue, we have those answers in UNCLOS. I would urge you, each one of you, just download it in your laptops, if you don't want to buy a copy, and you can find any issue that is coming up in maritime domain, you can find an answer to that in UNCLOS. So why are we not using it? Next is, UNCLOS also empower the coastal state to get into multilateral, bilateral agreements when it sees that certain countries do not have the wherewithal to do it on their own. So it's just not the developed countries it is addressing, it is also addressing that if the two poor countries of South Asia cannot do something on their own, on this issue, maritime law provides them, empowers them that much to get into arrangements among themselves. So in that way you also get an international legitimacy to your causes when you work together on certain issues. And there are so many of these, we can talk about it during Q&A. Last and my final point is, there are vast possibilities of research, of talk, of thinking in terms of legal and operational aspects of UNCLOS, and I think we need to start thinking about how we want to use UNCLOS to our own favor. And with this, I would want to thank you. This is a cover of my book. If somebody is interested, they might want to read this. With this, I rest my case, and if I am able to, enthuse even 1/4 of the minds here about UNCLOS and international maritime laws, domestic laws, and they have any questions, queries, or some discussion, I'll be happy to be a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. The lecture was truly engaging. We are now open to questions. We are now open to questions.
Good evening, ma'am. I'm Commander Arvind Kumar from MWC. In the third last slide, ma'am, if you can go back to that slide. This baseline of India, I've read this Gadget of India, and I've plotted all these baseline dots in the third last slide. Next slide.
This one?
Where India's map is there.
Okay.
Yes. As you can see, ma'am, the east coast of eastern side of Andaman Nicobar, the coordinates have not been given, sir. Ma'am, is there anything being done about it? What we are doing it? What are we doing about it?
I think the chief hydrographer would be the best person to answer this question, and I would not be privy to that kind of information, but I'm sure something is going on. That much I'm in knowledge of. I'm sorry, I just can't answer because I think this is something your own seniors can tell. But this is true that though we have settled our, the western side of our Andaman Nicobar Island, we do not have settled our eastern coast of Andaman Nicobar Island. And once that settles, we are going to gain a lot more easy within our waters, that's for sure. So that is one very tricky area where India might be going very, steadily.
Good evening, ma'am. I'm Commander Suraj Ayappa. Thank you very much for your insightful lecture. My question is twofold. As per our MZI Act, we require foreign warships to notify the government when they enter the EEZ. However, that is not required as per the UNCLOS provisions. So, what is the impact of India's credibility with this dichotomy, especially when we try to, enforce the provisions of UNCLOS in other areas of the world where they are not being followed? The alternate question is that the US has not ratified UNCLOS while they are conducting freedom of navigation operations in various parts of the world. And many argue that the US has no business doing so since they have not ratified UNCLOS, but the counter argument from the US side is that they follow customary international law, and although they haven't ratified UNCLOS, they still follow the UNCLOS in principle.
Could you come back to your first question again first?
The first question was the dichotomy between the MZI Act and the requirements of UNCLOS with respect to foreign warships notifying the government of India while entering the EEZ. And the so basically it's about what is your view on the impact of India's as well as the US's credibility in enforcing the provisions of UNCLOS while the dichotomy exists.
Excellent questions, thank you. And these are the questions we try, whenever I am also in certain international conferences, we discuss about it a lot. See, UNCLOS also provides a particular article where countries can provide, so that article was basically meant to give excuses to the countries if they don't want to ratify with certain kind of article under certain area. So they can put in their comments, and that would be notified that way. So under Article 288 or 287, I don't remember it on the top of my head. So under that article, only India provided that everything is good and fine. In fact, China also did the same thing, as you're aware, that everything is good and fine with EEZ, but we want foreign warships to notify when they are coming in our EEZ. This is something against UNCLOS because UNCLOS says that even in territorial waters, the foreign warships can go unless they are doing the peaceful navigation. So that kind of idea is there. Though these two things are separately, India governs by its domestic stance that we would want foreign warship to notify us every time they're crossing an EEZ, which is correct from India's point of view, which is not legally wrong because India gave it in writing to UNCLOS, in addition to China and other countries, that this is something we are not comfortable with UNCLOS and we would not agree to that part of it. So there is a legal battle between it. That India doesn't say that it's arbitrarily doing it. India can always say, see, we have given it in writing and UNCLOS that this is our condition and this we are going to follow. What happens is, what US does is, when it does this phone off sometimes, it tries to use that excessive claim article to say that India is encroaching in EEZ, basically trying to put extra claims to that to what it should have in EEZ in terms of using its EEZ waters. So that is what US would call excessive claims. So I don't see there's anything wrong with this. India has made its hands very clear about it that we have given it in writing, and whatever we are doing is not against anything in black and white. Second question, why US is not UNCLOS? So as the story tells you that the entire story of UNCLOS was initially seen from the developed countries' viewpoint. One of the biggest issues was resources. So the main issue that still remains in US Senate to ratify is that the moment they sign to the UNCLOS, they have to accede their seabed rights to other countries also, including Mexico. And that area is very rich in minerals and resources. So it will lose a lot of economic gain that it otherwise would have from the exploration. And that remains part of the reason why UNCLOS is not being ratified. Though President Obama also tried, and the presidents after that also tried to ratify this convention. And US keeps on saying that even if we have not signed UNCLOS, we live by the spirit of the UNCLOS, and that is why we conduct FONOPs and other overseas operations, overflight operations. So I think there is a clear-cut issue within US as well. That when we talk to politicians, they would say, we will lose our economic interests and everything. But when you talk to the Navy officers over there and anyone in the maritime domain, they totally understand that they are at the fault here, that they are trying to preach something that they are not themselves following. But that is the case of the world's biggest superpower, so you can't do much about it. Till the time, only thing you can do about it is keep calling it out till the time they realize the rest of the world is, being vocal about it, and they take a stand about it.
Good evening, ma'am. I am Sub-Lieutenant Inderveer Singh. And my question to you is, how can UNCLOS be applied in the recent cases, considering the freedom of navigation and the maritime securities, specifically in the Indo-Pacific region, now that China is showing great interest in that region?
So basically your question is, how can we use UNCLOS in Indo-Pacific?
Yes, ma'am.
Is the question? UNCLOS is applicable throughout the seas of all the maritime zones across the world. So beyond the coastal states' jurisdiction over the territorial seas, the EEZ has to be governed under certain rules by the countries. Beyond that, it's high seas, so anyone can encroach. So if China is trying to encroach in those waters, countries should use more and more UNCLOS. The provisions given in it by making their case at the international level that China is disregarding UNCLOS when it is doing XYZ activities, like Vietnam does, like Philippines does. Every time Chinese vessel is in their waters in terms of doing surveys, in terms of doing some kind of exploration, they send out a diplomatic note. What they don't do is, they just say that we need to uphold UNCLOS and we should resolve our disputes by peaceful manners. What they should actually do is also add the clauses of the UNCLOS. Under this clause, you are doing it wrong. So it becomes a very legal international matter, and give it a more weightage in terms of just saying that you are not following international law, by saying that XYZ rules are not followed or broken by China when they do XYZ activities or ABC activities. It gives more weight to a country's statement, is what I believe a country should do more in the Indo-Pacific now.
Good evening, ma'am. Commander Golgole from HQ FUMA. Ma'am, one input and one query. Internal waters, you said that unsure whether UNCLOS or MZI Act is applicable. Internal waters, as far as my knowledge goes, the law of the land route is applicable.
Law of the?
Law of the land. State laws.
State laws. Law.
What is applicable in the territorial waters. So that is the input. Second is the query. A classic example you had mentioned about archipelagic states. Now we have same situation of archipelagic in Lakshadweep Islands, and whereas we are mainland. So how it will be applicable? Is there any? How is it being applied, or the same manner the way it has been applied to mainland India? UNCLOS is applicable in Lakshadweep area.
All right, thank you. Good questions. Very good input. So I would want to ask, now you're aware of these things, I would want to ask you back, when state laws are there, who's there to enforce them then? in the maritime domain? Is it police will go to internal waters to, any type of activities? What is the thing that happens, if you're aware?
I'm just aware that the law of land is applicable.
Okay. So I was just got me to think.
Enforcing agency, I'm
Yeah,
not that clear about.
that
But
was my
internal waters, law of the land, concerned maybe state polices.
So that was my basic argument, that laws are there, who's there to enforce it? So police does not have those, whatever, motorized boats and all to go and do the, so who will do it?
I think most of the states are getting up with the marine police.
Exactly. So marine police is not doing. Is it in their charter? Because I don't think seeing in marine police charter, internal waters being governed by them.
I'll check on this. I'll get back to you.
Yeah. That's very
Actually, में कौन enforce कर रहा है? I'll get back to you on this.
great. Thank you. Second thing is archipelagic state that I said. I just complete this. That the technical rule of 9:1 has to follow. That 9 times of water should be there in its territorial waters to the 1 portion of land. So if I'm not been to Lakshadweep Island, so I can't say, but people who have gone there can answer it better. That do we fall into that category that our territorial waters are 9 times our islands? If we have, we can very well use the archipelagic rule. That is something I think you guys can answer better. So you people can answer better. Sorry.
Hello. Hi. So I had a question which was, is it possible for you to give a brief insight on essentially the impact of UNCLOS over the sovereign rights of the host states, such as India, which is a signatory to this particular policy? So what happens to the sovereign rights of the host states in the case where UNCLOS takes precedence over their own state rights?
So as I also mentioned in my talk also, that UNCLOS in fact empowers the coastal states with certain kind of rights. So in territorial waters you have the state jurisdiction over everything, you have all the laws applicable there. When it comes to contiguous zone, you have certain laws applicable. When it comes to EZ, you have certain other laws applicable. So I think it is in way empowering us coastal state. And very rarely there would be issues when UNCLOS and the coastal state act, either the MZI Act and other acts, will come into clash with each other. And it is in that scenario, I would myself think and encourage other people to think that if that happens, what should be the step that India would be taking? I do not have a clear answer to this because I think that requires deeper thinking and many more facets of Indian national security and other issues to consider before we can say that domestic law should take precedence in over international law in case they too come into clash. So I think otherwise we are empowered by UNCLOS. We should use more and more UNCLOS to our own favor.
Command Admiral Rajkumar, I'm here.
Sorry, yeah.
Just had a query. You did mention that unmanned submerged vessels are covered by UNCLOS, but I was always curious to know that, the kind of the frenetic pace and the astonishing pace with which unmanned vessels are going to come in future years, including unmanned submersibles. And the definitions in UNCLOS are very clear that a ship has a master, it has a crew. So is there any talk of how to legislate these vessels in the future, because they're going to get bigger and bigger? They'll be in the territorial waters, they'll be in our waters. So is there anything going on that to define the scope and the conduct of these vessels tomorrow in the future?
That's a very good question, and again requires a deeper level of thinking, because India has not thought about it. A lot more other countries have not thought about it, but US has definitely, and I have definitely seen one of the documents coming out from US Navy that is talking about the future of warfare with the underwater, vehicles, and what vehicles should, what is the definition of an underwater vehicle and what areas they are supposed to be used, and those kind of information. I think that can be one very good document to look at by all other countries in terms of emulating it. And I think UNCLOS does empower us in terms of talking about undersea, vessels and all. But the specificity of autonomous vehicles is something we also need to start looking at now. And using UNCLOS, I think we can club it together and form our own domestic laws in the coming times. But yeah, this is again an issue which is emerging, and we need to be very thoughtful about it.
Good afternoon, ma'am. My name is Kapildev Bahal. I'm seeking clarity, or rather your opinion on this term innocent passage, unarmed passage. So typically, I understand if it is a peaceful unarmed passage, that is clear enough. But if a vessel was using, it is unarmed, but using advanced research equipment to, let's say, do an underwater domain research or try to otherwise gather information, would you term that as innocent?
Okay, so UNCLOS does provide a certain kind of activities as not safe or an innocent passage, but it is yet to provide more clarity on what an innocent passage should look like. What is important here is what happens to these activities when these are happening in your EEZ, in your and your contiguous zone, or in your territorial waters. Because each time the operational jurisdiction would change for the coastal state. I think it is in that regard we need to see that peaceful is then when if I roughly remember the UNCLOS definition, that a ship is going from point A to B without stopping, maintaining a certain course. If I'm correct about it, anyone can correct me here. So that would be, and not causing any kind of activity which can be threatening the national security of the coastal state. I'm paraphrasing the entire thing. So if a country is doing it under sea, is it and peaceful passage also has its different meaning when it comes to EEZ and when it comes to territorial waters. So that also has to be seen. So when it comes to with each zone, delimitation zone, the definition, the operational jurisdiction of peaceful activities would change. So then we need to think about if it happens underwater, within our EEZ, what will happen? If it happens within our territorial waters, what will happen? I think it is in those lines we need to start thinking about it.
May I request Vice Admiral Sanjay Bhalla, NM, Chief of Staff, to kindly come on stage and felicitate our invitational speaker. I request Seminar Coordinator Ms. Uma Kabe, Project Research Associate, MHS, to propose the formal vote.
Good evening. On behalf of the Maritime History Society, I, Ms. Uma Kabe, Project Research Associate, would like to express our heartfelt gratitude for your presence and support at this remarkable event. Today, as we celebrate the successful completion of our first Monsoon Musings for the year 2023, it has been an absolute pleasure to have each and every one of you here. First and foremost, let me extend our deepest appreciation to our guest speaker. Your expertise, wisdom, and insight have truly enlightened us and provided us with invaluable guidance. Your presence here today has made a significant impact on all of us, and we are immensely grateful for your valuable contributions. We would also like to express our sincere gratitude to all the stakeholders: HQWNC, HQMNA, INS Ashwini, INS Kunjali, INS